How would you react if you heard your own voice calling for help from beneath the ground? Tonight on Silent Fears, we're sharing 11 disturbing testimonies from real people who experienced the unthinkable in America's most haunted cemeteries. From groundskeepers witnessing impossible phenomena to security guards watching their own burial on camera, these accounts will shatter everything you believe about death. Each story grows more terrifying than the last, building to encounters that defy all explanation. Subscribe to Silent Fears for more spine-chilling true stories, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, what time it is, and which cemetery incident disturbed you most. Let's move to our first story. My name is Samson, and I've been working as a groundskeeper at Riverside Cemetery in Salem, Oregon for the past 8 years. When people ask me about my job, they usually expect ghost stories or supernatural encounters. But honestly, for most of those years, the strangest thing I dealt with was the occasional raccoon family making their home in the older mausoleums. That changed 3 months ago on a foggy Tuesday morning that I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. I always start my shift at 6 a.m. sharp. The cemetery opens to visitors at 8, so those 2 hours give me time to handle maintenance without dealing with grieving families or curious tourists. That particular morning, the fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. Oregon mornings can be like that, especially in early September when the temperature drops overnight and the moisture just hangs in the air like a gray blanket. I remember parking my maintenance cart near the tool shed and grabbing my coffee thermos, still warm from the gas station stop I made on my way in. My routine never changes. Check the newer sections first, then work my way back to the historical areas where the headstones date back to the 1800s. The newer sections rarely need much work beyond basic upkeep. But that morning, something felt different the moment I stepped onto the main path. The fog seemed to muffle every sound, except for the crunch of gravel under my work boots. Even the usual morning bird sounds were absent, which should have been my first warning that this day wasn't going to go according to plan. I was about 20 minutes into my rounds when I reached Plot 47 Bisa, a section that houses graves from the 1960s through the 1980s. It's usually one of the easier areas to maintain because the families still visit regularly and keep the sites relatively clean. But as I approached my cart where I'd left it parked between 2 large oak trees, I stopped dead in my tracks. My rake, the one I'd specifically placed horizontally across the cart's tool holder, was now standing upright in the soft earth about 15 feet away from where I'd left it. At first, I thought maybe I'd just forgotten where I'd put it. 8 years of early mornings can play tricks on your memory, and I'd been pulling longer hours lately because we were short-staffed. But as I walked over to retrieve the rake, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The rake wasn't just stuck in the ground randomly. It was positioned perfectly upright next to a grave marker for someone named Colette, who had passed away in 1979. The metal tines were buried exactly 2 inches deep into the soil, as if someone had carefully measured and placed it there with precision. I pulled the rake free and examined the ground around it. The earth was still soft from the previous night's rain, and there should have been footprints if someone had moved my tool. But the grass around Colette's grave was undisturbed, still holding dewdrops that would have been scattered if anyone had walked through the area. I looked back toward my cart, trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe the fog was playing tricks on my vision. Maybe I'd absent-mindedly stuck the rake in the ground myself and simply forgotten about it in the 30 seconds it took me to walk the perimeter. I returned the rake to my cart and continued my rounds, but I couldn't shake the unsettled feeling that had settled in my chest. The fog seemed to be getting thicker rather than lifting as the sun came up, and the silence was becoming oppressive. Usually by 6:30, I could hear the morning traffic starting to build on the main road that runs along the cemetery's eastern border. But that morning, everything remained unnaturally quiet. About 10 minutes later, I was trimming some overgrown grass near the cemetery's central fountain when I heard the distinct sound of metal scraping against stone. It was the kind of sound my shovel makes when I accidentally hit a headstone while digging, sharp and grating. I turned around, expecting to see another groundskeeper who might have come in early. But the fog had gotten so thick that I could barely make out the shapes of the nearest grave markers. The scraping sound came again, definitely coming from the direction of plot 47B, where I'd found the displaced rake. Against every instinct telling me to wait for the fog to clear or for my supervisor to arrive, I grabbed my flashlight and headed back toward the sound. The beam barely penetrated the fog, creating more of a diffused glow than actual illumination. But it was better than stumbling around blind. As I got closer to plot 47B, I could hear what sounded like rhythmic digging, the steady chunk, chunk, chunk of a shovel breaking through earth and hitting roots. When I reached the area where I'd found the rake, I stopped and swept my flashlight beam across the ground. What I saw made me question everything I thought I knew about my job and the cemetery I'd been caring for all these years. There, next to Colette's grave, was my shovel, standing perfectly upright just like the rake had been. But this time, there was a small pile of fresh earth next to it, as if someone had been digging and then simply abandoned their work mid-task. I approached the shovel cautiously, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I could hear it over the silence. The metal blade was clean, but there were definitely clumps of dark soil clinging to the edges. I knelt down and examined the small pile of earth, running it through my fingers. It was the same composition as the soil throughout that section of the cemetery, dark and loamy, with the slightly sweet smell that comes from decades of decomposed flowers and organic matter. But here's what really disturbed me. When I looked at Colette's actual grave, there was no sign of disturbance. The grass was still intact, the headstone was clean, and there were no indentations in the earth to suggest any digging had taken place. Yet there was my shovel, covered in soil that had definitely come from somewhere, and a pile of earth that had obviously been excavated from the ground. I pulled out my cell phone to take pictures, thinking I'd need to file some kind of incident report with my supervisor. But the camera wouldn't focus properly in the fog. Every shot came out as a blurry, gray mess that proved absolutely nothing. I tried calling my supervisor, but the call went straight to voicemail, which wasn't unusual since it was still before 7 a.m., and Moises never answered his phone until after his second cup of coffee. I collected my shovel and decided to finish my rounds as quickly as possible. But over the next hour, the pattern repeated itself 3 more times. I'd place a tool in one location, turn my attention to another task, and find the tool relocated to a different spot, always standing upright next to a grave marker, always with evidence that it had been used for digging, but never with any corresponding disturbance to the actual burial sites. By the time the fog started to lift around 8:30 a.m., I'd found my hedge trimmers next to a grave from 1962, my small spade beside a marker from 1975, and even my water bottle, which I'd left on the cart's cup holder, sitting upright on top of a headstone dated 1981. Each relocation was precise and deliberate, as if whoever was moving these items had a specific system or purpose that I couldn't understand. When Moises finally arrived at 9 a.m., I tried to explain what had been happening. But even to my own ears, the story sounded ridiculous. Tools don't move themselves. Shovels don't dig holes without human intervention. Dead people certainly don't borrow groundskeeping equipment to perform mysterious excavation projects. Moises listened patiently, but I could see the concern in his eyes. The kind of look you give someone when you're wondering if they've been drinking or if the stress of the job has finally gotten to them. He walked with me back to plot 47B, where I showed him the small piles of earth that had appeared throughout the morning. By then, the fog had completely cleared, and in the bright daylight, the evidence looked less dramatic and more like the kind of minor soil displacement that happens naturally from weather and settling. Moises suggested I take the rest of the day off, maybe see a doctor about my stress levels, and we'd talk about adjusting my schedule to include more support staff. But I know what I experienced that morning wasn't stress or fatigue or fog-induced hallucinations. Something in Riverside Cemetery was using my tools, methodically and purposefully moving them from location to location, digging in earth that showed no signs of disturbance. And the most unsettling part wasn't the mystery of how it was happening, but the growing realization that it seemed to be following some kind of pattern, moving chronologically through graves from the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, as if searching for something specific among the dead. I've been back to work for 3 months now, and the incidents haven't repeated themselves, at least not during the daylight hours when I'm there. But sometimes, when I arrive for my 6 a.m. shift and the fog is particularly thick, I'll find small piles of earth scattered throughout plot 47B, always next to graves from that same era, always suggesting that someone or something continues the search long after I've gone home for the day. That's my story, and I'm sharing it because I need people to know that some places hold mysteries that can't be explained by logic or rationality. Riverside Cemetery looks peaceful and well-maintained during visiting hours. But in those quiet morning hours before the world wakes up, something walks among the graves with a purpose I may never understand, borrowing the tools of the living to continue whatever unfinished business binds it to that foggy section of plot 47B. Let's move to our second story. My name is Lorelei, and I'm a retired librarian who spent the last 5 years researching my family genealogy. What started as a simple curiosity about my ancestors turned into an obsession that led me to libraries, historical societies, and cemeteries across New England. I thought I'd seen every type of record, every kind of family mystery that could emerge from dusty archives and faded photographs. That was until last month in August 2025, when I visited Woodland Memorial Park in Burlington, Vermont, and discovered something that completely shattered my understanding of life, death, and the reliability of official records. I had driven up from Boston on a crisp, late summer afternoon, the kind of day when the early autumn colors are just starting to show on the maple trees. My great-great-grandmother Jayla had supposedly been buried in Woodland Memorial Park in 2015, but I'd never been able to find her grave or any official burial records. The Burlington Historical Society had suggested I check the cemetery's original handwritten ledgers, which were kept in a small office building near the main entrance. These ledgers, they told me, sometimes contained information that never made it into the modern digital databases. The cemetery office was run by an elderly man named Luca, who had been the groundskeeper there for over 20 years. He was happy to let me examine the old ledgers, thick, leather-bound books with yellowed pages that chronicled every burial from the cemetery's founding in 1960 through the present day. The smell of old paper and binding glue filled the small room as Luca pulled down volume after volume, dating them by the printed labels on their spines. I started with the 2015 ledger, running my finger down columns of names, dates, and plot numbers. The handwriting was neat and professional, the kind of careful documentation you'd expect from modern record-keeping. Each entry included the deceased's name, date of death, date of burial, plot location, and sometimes additional notes about the family or cause of death. It was fascinating to read through these records, like glimpsing into the personal tragedies and stories of people who had been forgotten by everyone except their descendants. About 2 hours into my research, I found what I was looking for. Jayla Mitchell, deceased August 12, 2015, buried August 15, 2015, plot 34J, pneumonia. But as I continued reading through the entries, something strange began to emerge. I started noticing names that seemed familiar, not from my family research, but from somewhere more recent and personal. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence. Common names appear in every cemetery record, and it's easy to imagine connections that don't exist. But then I saw it, written in that same careful script from 2018. Musa Hendricks, deceased March 8, 2018, buried March 11, 2018, plot 67A, heart failure. The name stopped me cold because Musa was my neighbor back in Boston. I had just spoken to him the week before about trimming the hedge that grew between our properties. He was 72 years old, healthy, and definitely not dead in 2018, considering he would have been 65 at that time and very much alive. I stared at the entry for several minutes, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a different Musa, maybe a relative with the same name. But as I continued reading, I found more names that I recognized from my current life. Hayden Foster, deceased June 19, 2021, buried June 22, 2021, plot 88C, COVID-19 complications. Hayden was my dentist. She had cleaned my teeth just 2 months earlier and had definitely not died of COVID in 2021. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that this had to be coincidence. People reuse names within families, and Burlington isn't that large a city. But the names kept appearing, entry after entry of people I knew personally, all recorded as having died and been buried in recent years while I knew them to be alive. My mail carrier, my pharmacist, the woman who cut my hair, even my next-door neighbor's teenage son, all listed in these handwritten records from 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. I started taking photographs of the ledger pages with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the device steady. Luca noticed my distress and asked if I was feeling all right. I showed him some of the entries, explained that these were names of people I knew to be alive. But he just shrugged and said that names repeat themselves all the time in small communities. Families honor their ancestors by giving children the same names, he explained. And it creates patterns that can seem unsettling if you're not familiar with local history. But I knew these weren't ancestor names or family repetitions. These were the exact people I interacted with in my daily life, listed with death dates from the past few years. I asked Luca if I could see the burial plots themselves, thinking maybe the physical evidence would help me understand what was happening. He provided me with a cemetery map and wished me luck, mentioning that some of the newer sections could be hard to navigate as the sun started setting. I spent the next 3 hours walking through Woodland Memorial Park with the ledger photographs on my phone, locating plot numbers and reading headstones. Every single grave I found confirmed the ledger entries. The names, dates, and causes of death all matched exactly. But these weren't weathered headstones from people who had died years ago. These were fresh markers, some so new they still had the sharp edges that come from recent engraving. Plot 67A contained a beautiful granite headstone reading, Musa, 1953 to 2025, beloved neighbor and friend. The death date was clearly carved as 2025, showing the current year. But the ledger from the office had recorded his death as occurring in 2018. Hayden's headstone in Plot 88C showed similar impossible dates. Hayden, 1965 to 2025. Caring professional and friend. Again, a death date showing 2025, corresponding to a ledger entry from 2021. As the afternoon light began to fade, I realized I was looking at something that defied every logical explanation I could construct. These were not coincidences or name repetitions. These were the exact people from my current life, with headstones showing 2025 death dates, but recorded in cemetery ledgers as having died in the recent past. The implications were so disturbing that I couldn't process them fully. Was I looking at some kind of prediction? Was this cemetery somehow documenting deaths before they happened? I tried calling Musa from the cemetery to confirm he was still alive, but my phone had no signal among the tall trees and granite monuments. The rational part of my mind insisted that there had to be an explanation, some kind of administrative error or elaborate coincidence that I wasn't seeing. But as I walked back toward the office building, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. There, in the newer section of the cemetery near the parking area, was a headstone that read, Lorelei, 1952 to 2025, devoted researcher and grandmother. The death date was carved as 2025, showing the current year. My birth year was correct, my name was correct, and the description matched my life perfectly. I am a researcher, and I am a grandmother to 3 beautiful children who visit me every Sunday for dinner. I ran back to Luca's office, but the building was locked and dark. A small sign on the door indicated that office hours ended at 4 p.m., and it was now nearly 6 p.m. I banged on the door and called out, but no one answered. My car keys were shaking in my hands as I fumbled to unlock my vehicle, desperate to get away from Woodland Memorial Park and the impossible records it contained. The drive back to Boston should have taken 2 hours, but I made it in less than 90 minutes, breaking every speed limit and running through yellow lights. I needed to see Musa, needed to confirm that he was alive and well, that whatever I'd discovered in that cemetery was just an elaborate mistake or some kind of psychological breakdown on my part. Musa's house was dark when I pulled into my driveway, but I could see the glow of his television through his living room window. I knocked on his door until he answered, probably wondering why his neighbor was visiting at 8 p.m. on a weeknight. When he opened the door, healthy and very much alive, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But when I tried to explain what I'd found, the words sounded insane, even to my own ears. Musa listened patiently as I described the cemetery ledgers and the impossible dates, but I could see the concern growing in his eyes. He suggested I might be working too hard on my genealogy research, that sometimes when we spend too much time digging through old records, we start seeing patterns and connections that aren't really there. He recommended I take a break from the research, maybe talk to my doctor about the stress I'd been under since my husband passed away 2 years ago. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my own headstone, about the 2025 date that represented the current year. I tried to convince myself that it was all coincidence, that there were probably thousands of women named Lorelei, born in 1952, and that the cemetery records were just clerical errors or elaborate pranks. But over the next few weeks, I started noticing things that hadn't registered before. Musa seemed to be losing weight rapidly. Hayden mentioned during my dental cleaning that she'd been having some concerning symptoms and was scheduling additional tests. My mail carrier looked pale and tired, mentioning that he'd been having chest pains but hadn't had time to see a doctor. I tried researching Woodland Memorial Park online, looking for any information about unusual record keeping or supernatural phenomena. but found nothing beyond basic historical information and visiting hours. I called the Burlington Historical Society, but they had no knowledge of any irregularities in the cemetery's documentation. Everyone I spoke to treated my concerns as the product of an overactive imagination or stress-related delusions. Now, as 2025 continues, I find myself caught between rational skepticism and growing terror. I've stopped doing genealogy research entirely, but I can't stop thinking about those ledger entries and the dates carved into granite headstones. I've written letters to be opened if something happens to me, documenting everything I found at Woodland Memorial Park. But even as I write this, I wonder if anyone will believe such an impossible story. The most disturbing part isn't the possibility that something might happen to me this year, but the realization that there might be places in this world where time works differently, where the past and future intersect in ways that our rational minds can't process. Woodland Memorial Park looks like any other cemetery, peaceful and well-maintained, but hidden in its office ledgers are records that suggest death isn't as final or as unpredictable as we believe. That's my story, and I'm sharing it because I need people to know that sometimes family research can lead to discoveries that change everything we think we know about life and death. If something does happen to me in 2025, I want people to investigate Woodland Memorial Park and its impossible records, because whatever I found there needs to be understood before anyone else stumbles across their own name carved in granite with dates that shouldn't exist yet. Let's move to our third story. My name is Kevin, and until 3 weeks ago, I considered myself a rational person who didn't believe in anything that couldn't be explained by science or logic. I'm a software engineer who works from home, and my only real hobby is running. Every night at 11 p.m., I put on my Nike running shoes and hit the pavement for exactly 5 miles through my neighborhood in Nashville, Tennessee. The late hour works perfectly for my schedule, and the empty streets give me time to think and decompress from long days of coding. My usual route takes me through several residential areas before ending at Fairview Cemetery, where I do a quick loop around the perimeter fence before heading home. I've been running this same path for almost 2 years, and I know every streetlight, every crack in the sidewalk, and every house along the way. The cemetery section was always my favorite part because it's peaceful and well lit, with tall oak trees that provide nice shade during summer runs and beautiful scenery year-round. 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday night, I was about 4 miles into my run when I reached the cemetery's main entrance. The wrought iron gates were locked as usual, but the sidewalk runs along the entire eastern border, giving me a clear view of the headstones and monuments inside. I was checking my fitness tracker when I noticed something that made me slow my pace. There was someone else on the sidewalk about 50 yards behind me, also running in the same direction. At first, I didn't think much of it. Nashville has plenty of night runners, and seeing another person out for late exercise wasn't unusual. But as I continued along the cemetery's perimeter, I kept glancing back and noticed that the other runner was maintaining the exact same distance behind me. They weren't trying to catch up or pass me, and they weren't falling further behind. They were just there, keeping perfect pace about 50 yards back. I couldn't make out many details in the streetlight shadows, but I could see it was a tall figure wearing dark clothing. What struck me as odd was how quietly they were running. My Nike shoes make a distinct rhythmic sound against the pavement, and I'm used to hearing the footsteps of other runners when they're nearby. But despite being close enough that I should have heard their footfalls, there was complete silence except for my own breathing and the sound of my shoes hitting concrete. When I reached the cemetery's northwest corner, where my route normally takes me away from the fence and back toward residential streets, I decided to test something. Instead of making my usual left turn, I continued straight along the cemetery's northern border. Behind me, the other runner did the same thing, maintaining that exact 50-yard distance. I slowed my pace from my usual 7-minute mile to about 8 minutes. The figure behind me slowed as well. I sped up to a 6-minute mile pace that left me breathing hard. The other runner matched that too. By the time I completed an entire loop around Fairview Cemetery, my heart rate monitor was showing numbers that had nothing to do with physical exertion. I was genuinely disturbed by this silent follower who seemed to anticipate my every movement. When I finally turned away from the cemetery to head home, I looked back one more time and saw the figure stop at the exact spot where I'd turned. They didn't continue around the cemetery or head in a different direction. They just stopped and stood there, watching me leave. I made it home in record time, constantly checking over my shoulder but seeing no sign of my mysterious running companion. That night, I barely slept, trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was another runner who happened to have a similar route and pace. Maybe the lack of footstep sounds was due to expensive running shoes or the way sound carries differently at night. Maybe my imagination was creating connections that didn't exist. The next night, I decided to skip my run and work late instead. But Thursday evening, I was back to my regular routine, hoping that Tuesday's experience had been a one-time coincidence. I felt confident and relaxed as I covered the first 4 miles, enjoying the cool October air and the familiar rhythm of my workout. But when I approached Fairview Cemetery, my confidence evaporated completely. There, in the exact same spot where I'd first noticed them 2 nights earlier, was the same tall figure in dark clothing. This time I was ready for them, so I immediately started paying attention to details. The figure appeared to be wearing a black hooded sweatshirt and dark pants, but I couldn't make out any facial features or other identifying characteristics. Most disturbingly, as I continued along the cemetery fence, they began following me again with that same perfect 50-yard distance and complete silence. I decided to try something different. About halfway along the cemetery's eastern border, I stopped completely and turned around to face my follower. For about 10 seconds, we stood there on the empty sidewalk, separated by 50 yards and the glow of 3 streetlights. The figure didn't approach me or retreat. They just stood there, perfectly still, like they were waiting for me to make the next move. When I started running again, they resumed following me. When I turned away from the cemetery at my usual corner, they stopped at the same spot as before. The pattern was identical to Tuesday night. But this time, I was certain that something unnatural was happening. Normal people don't behave this way. Normal runners don't follow strangers in complete silence, matching their pace perfectly while maintaining exact distances. Over the next week, I tried everything I could think of to break the pattern or identify my follower. I changed my running time to 10 p.m., then to midnight. The figure was always there, waiting at the same spot near the cemetery entrance. I tried running the route in reverse, starting at the cemetery and working my way back through the neighborhoods. The figure appeared at my usual endpoint and followed me backward through the entire route. One night, I brought my phone and tried to take pictures, but every photo came out as a blurry mess of streetlight and shadows. I couldn't get a clear image of the figure no matter what angle I tried or how steady I held the camera. I even tried recording video while running, but the footage showed only empty sidewalk behind me, even though I could clearly see the figure following me with my naked eyes. The most terrifying night was last Friday, when I decided to confront whatever was following me. I'd been thinking about it all week, and I was tired of being afraid of my own running routine. When I reached the spot where the figure always appeared, I stopped and called out, asking who they were and why they were following me. My voice echoed off the cemetery's stone walls, but there was no response. I started running with the intention of stopping every quarter mile to turn around and demand answers. But when I stopped the first time and looked back, the figure was gone. The sidewalk behind me was empty, stretching back to the cemetery entrance with nothing but streetlights and shadows. I stood there for 5 minutes, scanning every direction, but saw no sign of where they could have gone. There were no side streets, no buildings to hide behind, no trees large enough to conceal a person. Relieved that my confrontational approach had apparently worked, I continued my run home. But about half a mile later, as I passed under a particularly bright streetlight, I glanced at my shadow on the pavement and felt my blood turn to ice water. My shadow wasn't alone. There, running alongside my shadow on the concrete, was the distinct silhouette of another person maintaining that same 50-yard distance. I stopped running and looked behind me, but the sidewalk was empty. I looked down at the pavement, and there were 2 shadows, mine and another figure's, both perfectly visible in the streetlight's glow. I moved my arms, and my shadow moved accordingly. The other shadow remained still, like someone standing 50 yards behind me with their arms at their sides. I ran the rest of the way home faster than I'd ever run in my life. But every streetlight I passed showed the same thing. 2 shadows on the pavement, mine and another's, even though I was completely alone on the street. When I finally reached my house and stood under my porch light, I looked down one more time. There was only my shadow, single and normal, cast by my body onto my front steps. Since that night, I've stopped running my usual route entirely. I've been using a treadmill at a 24-hour gym instead. But the artificial environment feels hollow and unsatisfying compared to my old outdoor routine. I've tried running different outdoor routes around Nashville, but none of them feel right. And I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder for figures that aren't there. Last weekend, I drove past Fairview Cemetery during daylight hours, hoping that seeing it in bright sunshine would help me rationalize what had been happening during my night runs. The cemetery looked peaceful and normal, with well-maintained grounds and beautiful old trees. I parked my car and walked along the same sidewalk where I'd encountered my mysterious follower. But everything seemed ordinary and unremarkable. But as I was walking back toward my car, I noticed something that made my hands start shaking. There, pressed into a soft patch of dirt near the cemetery's main entrance, were footprints. 2 sets of them, running side by side, both the same size as my Nike running shoes. One set was clearly fresh, probably from someone's morning run earlier that day. The other set looked older, partially filled with fallen leaves and morning dew, but still clearly visible. I knelt down and compared the older footprints to my shoe. They were an exact match, down to the distinctive tread pattern of my specific Nike model. But I hadn't run this route in over a week, and I certainly hadn't been to the cemetery during daylight hours. Yet there were my footprints, or footprints identical to mine, running alongside someone else's prints in the soft earth near Fairview Cemetery's entrance. The most disturbing part wasn't the mystery of how my footprints had gotten there, but the realization that the other set of prints, the ones running alongside mine, didn't match any shoe pattern I recognized. They were smooth and uniform, without the complex tread designs that modern running shoes have. They looked more like the prints that bare feet would make if someone with feet the exact size and shape of my own had been running without shoes. That's my story, and I'm sharing it because I need people to understand that there are some places where the normal rules don't apply, where something can follow you without being seen, where your shadow can have company even when you're completely alone. I still live in Nashville, and I still run regularly. But I avoid Fairview Cemetery entirely now. Sometimes, late at night when I'm running other routes, I catch glimpses of my shadow under streetlights and feel a moment of panic. But so far it's always been just me. Just my single shadow on the pavement, the way shadows are supposed to be. Let's move to our fourth story. My name is Ivory, and I'm a professional photographer who specializes in capturing the beauty of historical locations throughout the American South. Over the past decade, I've photographed everything from antebellum mansions to Civil War battlefields. But cemeteries have always held a special place in my portfolio. There's something about the way light filters through old trees and illuminates weathered headstones that creates absolutely stunning compositions, especially during golden hour when the sun sits low on the horizon. Last month, I received a commission from a local historical society to photograph Pine Hill Cemetery in Savannah, Georgia, for their upcoming heritage calendar. The cemetery dates back to 1847 and contains some of the most elaborate Victorian-era monuments I'd ever seen. The Spanish moss draping from ancient oak trees creates natural frames for photographs, and the late September afternoon light promised to be absolutely perfect for the kind of atmospheric shots that have made my reputation. I arrived at Pine Hill around 4 p.m. with my Canon camera, 3 different lenses, and enough equipment to capture every angle and lighting condition the cemetery might offer. The humidity was typical for Savannah in late summer, thick enough that I could feel it clinging to my skin, but the golden sunlight streaming through the moss-draped branches more than made up for any physical discomfort. I've learned over the years that the best cemetery photographs happen when you take your time. Really observe the interplay of light and shadow, and wait for those perfect moments when everything aligns. I started in the older section near the main entrance, photographing some of the more elaborate marble angels and ornate family mausoleums. My camera was performing beautifully, and I was getting exactly the kind of shots I'd hoped for: rich contrasts between the dark Spanish moss and the pale stone monuments, with golden sunlight creating dramatic highlights and deep shadows. I always shoot in both digital and film formats for important commissions, so I was working methodically through each composition, making sure to capture multiple exposures and angles. About an hour into the session, I was photographing a particularly striking monument when I noticed something odd in my camera's LCD preview screen. There, standing between 2 headstones, about 20 feet behind my intended subject, was the clear figure of a woman in what appeared to be a white dress. She wasn't moving, just standing there, perfectly still. But she definitely hadn't been there when I'd set up the shot just moments earlier. I lowered my camera and looked directly at the spot where the figure had appeared on my screen. But I saw nothing except empty space between the headstones. The afternoon light was still strong enough that I should have been able to see anyone standing in that area. But there was absolutely no one there. I raised my camera again and looked through the viewfinder, and once again, there was the woman in white, standing in exactly the same position. I took the photograph, thinking that whatever was causing this optical illusion might be captured in the final image and help me understand what was happening. When I reviewed the shot on my camera's display, the woman was clearly visible in the photograph, standing among the headstones with perfect clarity and detail. She appeared to be middle-aged, wearing a long white dress that looked like it might be from the early 1900s, and she was looking directly at my camera with an expression that seemed both sad and urgent. As a professional photographer, I've seen all kinds of technical glitches, lens flares, and optical phenomena that can create false images. But this was different. The figure was too detailed, too consistent, and too clearly defined to be any kind of equipment malfunction or atmospheric effect. I checked my camera settings, cleaned my lens thoroughly, and even switched to a different lens entirely. But every photograph I took of that area continued to show the same woman in the same position. What made the situation even more unsettling was that she only appeared in my photographs when I was shooting in a specific direction toward the cemetery's eastern section. If I turned my camera toward any other area, my images were completely normal, showing nothing but headstones, trees, and Spanish moss exactly as they appeared to my naked eye. But whenever I pointed my lens toward that particular section of Pine Hill Cemetery, there she was, standing motionless among the graves. I decided to approach the area where she appeared in my photographs, thinking that maybe I'd discover some logical explanation once I got closer. As I walked toward the eastern section, I kept my camera raised and continued taking pictures, documenting how the woman's image changed as I moved closer to her apparent location. In each successive photograph, she appeared more detailed and more clearly defined, but I still couldn't see anything with my own eyes. When I reached the spot where she seemed to be standing, I found myself in front of a simple granite headstone that read, Anaya Morrison, 1878 to 1919, beloved wife and mother. The grave was well maintained despite its age, with fresh flowers that looked like they'd been placed recently. But there was still no visible sign of any person, living or otherwise, anywhere in the immediate area. I photographed Anaya's headstone from several angles, and in every single image, the woman in white appeared to be standing directly on or near the grave. But now, instead of looking at my camera, she seemed to be gesturing towards something beyond the frame of my photographs. I followed the direction of her gesture and found myself looking toward a section of the cemetery that appeared to be abandoned or neglected, with overgrown grass and headstones that were tilted or partially hidden by vegetation, curiosity overcoming my growing unease. I made my way to the neglected area and began photographing the overgrown graves. The first few shots showed nothing unusual, just weathered headstones and tangled vegetation. But when I reached what appeared to be the very back corner of the cemetery, my camera began capturing images that made my hands shake so badly I could barely hold the equipment steady. There, in photograph after photograph, were dozens of figures in period clothing from different eras. Men in Civil War uniforms, women in Victorian dresses, children in clothing that looked like it was from the early 1800s. They were all standing among the overgrown graves, some looking directly at my camera, others pointing toward specific headstones or gestures toward areas where the grass had grown so thick that any markers were completely hidden. I shot 3 full memory cards worth of photographs in that abandoned section, documenting what appeared to be an entire gathering of people from different time periods, all completely invisible to my naked eye, but clearly present in every digital image. Some of the figures appeared solid and detailed, while others were more translucent or partially faded, but all of them seemed to be trying to communicate something through their poses and gestures. The most disturbing discovery came when I reviewed the images on my camera's larger LCD screen and realized that many of the figures were pointing toward areas of ground that showed no visible headstones or markers. I began clearing away some of the overgrown grass and vegetation, and underneath I found fragments of very old burial markers, some so weathered and broken that only partial names and dates were still legible. As the sun began to set and the golden hour light started to fade, I noticed that the figures in my photographs were becoming more numerous and more animated. Instead of standing still, they appeared to be moving between shots, gathering around specific graves or pointing more urgently toward areas of the cemetery that I hadn't yet explored. It was as if they knew I could see them through my camera and were trying to guide me toward something important. I followed their gestures to a section near the cemetery's back fence, where the grass was particularly overgrown and tangled. When I cleared away some of the vegetation, I discovered what appeared to be a small family plot with several broken headstones and one intact marker that read, Morrison Family Plot, 1847 to 1920. This was clearly related to Anaya Morrison, whose grave had been the first place I'd encountered the woman in white. I photographed the Morrison family plot extensively, and in these final images, the woman in white appeared more clearly than she had in any previous shot. She was no longer looking at my camera or gesturing toward other areas. Instead, she was kneeling beside one of the broken headstones, with her hands pressed against the weathered granite as if she were trying to protect or preserve something that was being lost to time and neglect. When I finally left Pine Hill Cemetery that evening, my memory cards contained over 400 photographs, at least half of which showed figures that had been completely invisible to my eyes during the entire session. I spent the next week processing and analyzing the images, trying to find some technical explanation for what I'd captured. But every photograph was technically perfect, with no signs of double exposure, lens flare, or digital artifacts. I researched the history of Pine Hill Cemetery and discovered that the abandoned section where I'd photographed the largest gathering of figures had indeed been the original burial ground, established in 1847. Due to poor record-keeping and natural disasters over the decades, many of the graves in that area had lost their markers or had been forgotten entirely. The Morrison family had been among the cemetery's original founders, and Anaya Morrison had spent years advocating for better maintenance and preservation of the forgotten graves before her death in 1919. I presented my photographs to the Historical Society, but I only showed them the conventional images of monuments and landscapes. I kept the supernatural photographs to myself, uncertain how to explain or contextualize what I'd captured. But I did mention the condition of the abandoned section and the Morrison family plot, suggesting that it might be worthy of restoration or historical preservation efforts. 3 weeks later, the Historical Society contacted me with surprising news. They had secured funding to restore the neglected section of Pine Hill Cemetery, including proper markers for graves that had been lost or forgotten over the decades. They credited my photography session with bringing attention to an important part of Savannah's history that had been overlooked for too long. I returned to Pine Hill Cemetery last week to photograph the restoration work in progress, bringing the same camera and equipment I'd used during my original session. This time, every photograph I took showed exactly what I could see with my naked eye. Workers clearing vegetation, historians researching grave records, and craftsmen preparing new markers for forgotten burials. There were no mysterious figures, no woman in white, and no supernatural phenomena of any kind. But when I photographed the restored Morrison family plot, with its newly cleaned headstones and properly maintained grounds, I found one final image on my memory card that I definitely hadn't taken intentionally. It showed Anaya Morrison's grave, with fresh flowers and a small handwritten note that read, "Thank you for helping us remember." The handwriting was old-fashioned and elegant, and the paper looked aged despite the fact that everything else in the photograph was clearly contemporary. That's my story, and I'm sharing it because I believe that sometimes the past reaches out to the present through whatever means available, asking us to remember and honor those who have been forgotten. Pine Hill Cemetery now has a properly maintained historical section thanks to what I captured through my camera lens. But I'll never fully understand how Anaya Morrison and the other forgotten souls managed to make themselves visible to my equipment while remaining invisible to human eyes. Let's move to our fifth story. My name is Camilo, and when I was 8 years old, I experienced something in Mountain View Cemetery in Boulder, Colorado, that fundamentally changed how I understood the world around me. This happened 23 years ago, during the winter of 2002. But I remember every detail as clearly as if it occurred yesterday. Some childhood memories fade with time, but the terrifying ones seem to burn themselves into your mind with perfect clarity, especially when they involve things that adults insist couldn't possibly be real. My father worked as the head groundskeeper at Mountain View Cemetery, a position he'd held for over 15 years by the time this incident occurred. During school breaks and summer vacations, I often accompanied him to work, partly because my mother worked long shifts at the hospital, and partly because I genuinely enjoyed spending time in the peaceful environment of the cemetery. Most children might find graveyards creepy or frightening, but to me, Mountain View was just another part of my father's workplace, as familiar and comfortable as any office building. December in Boulder can be brutally cold, and that particular winter had brought more snow than usual. The cemetery looked like a winter wonderland, with snow-covered headstones and bare tree branches creating intricate patterns against the gray sky. My father had received reports of some vandalism in the older section of the cemetery, and he needed to assess the damage and file a report with the cemetery board. Since it was winter break and I had no school, he brought me along for what he expected would be a quick inspection trip. I remember wearing my bright red winter coat, the one with the puffy sleeves that made me look like a miniature astronaut, along with snow boots that were slightly too big for my feet. My father carried his heavy key ring that jingled with every step, a sound that I associated with his authority and competence. He could unlock any gate, any maintenance building, any section of Mountain View Cemetery, and that made him seem incredibly important and powerful to my 8-year-old mind. We arrived at the cemetery around 2 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. The snow was about 6 inches deep and unmarked, except for the tracks left by rabbits and squirrels. My father parked our truck near the maintenance building and gathered his clipboard, camera, and other tools he needed for documenting any damage. The sky was overcast and threatening more snow, which meant we needed to complete our inspection quickly before weather conditions made driving dangerous. The vandalism had occurred in Section C, an area that contained graves dating from the 1920s through the 1950s. Someone had apparently knocked over several headstones and scattered decorative items that families had left at various grave sites. My father was methodical in his approach, photographing each instance of damage and making detailed notes about what would need to be repaired or replaced. I followed him dutifully, trying to step in his footprints to avoid getting snow in my boots. About 30 minutes into our inspection, I noticed something that made me stop walking and stare across the cemetery grounds. There, near a cluster of pine trees in Section D, I could see people walking among the headstones. At first, I assumed they were other visitors who had come to pay respects to deceased family members. But something about their appearance struck me as odd. They seemed to be dressed in old-fashioned clothing, and they were moving very slowly and deliberately through the snow. I tugged on my father's coat sleeve and pointed toward the figures, asking him who those people were and whether they were supposed to be in the cemetery during his work hours. He looked in the direction I was pointing, shielded his eyes against the glare of snow and overcast sky, and told me he didn't see anyone. When I insisted that there were definitely people walking near the pine trees, he suggested that I might be seeing shadows cast by the trees, or perhaps some of the larger monuments creating optical illusions in the winter light. But I knew what I was seeing, and it wasn't shadows or optical illusions. There were at least 6 or 7 people moving through Section D, and as I watched them more carefully, I realized that something was very wrong with the scene. These people were walking through the snow without leaving any footprints behind them. The snow in that section of the cemetery was completely unmarked and pristine, showing no evidence that anyone had disturbed its surface. Yet I could clearly see figures moving through the area. The people appeared to be from different time periods based on their clothing I saw women in long dresses that looked like they belonged in old movies, men wearing suits and hats that seemed old-fashioned, and even a few children dressed in clothing that looked nothing like what kids wore in 2002. They all moved with a strange, floating quality, as if they weren't quite touching the ground, which would explain why they left no tracks in the snow. My father continued his work, occasionally glancing in the direction I kept pointing, but clearly seeing nothing unusual. I began to feel frustrated and confused by his inability to see what was so obvious to me. The figures were becoming more numerous as the afternoon progressed, and they seemed to be gathering around specific grave sites throughout Section D. Some of them appeared to be kneeling beside headstones, while others stood in small groups as if they were having conversations. As we moved closer to Section D during our inspection route, I could see the figures more clearly, and what I observed made my 8-year-old mind struggle to process what was happening. These people looked solid and real, but there was something translucent about them, as if they were made of the same material as colored glass. I could see their faces, their clothing, even their expressions. But I could also see the headstones and trees behind them, as if they were there, but not entirely there at the same time. The most disturbing part of the experience was when one of the figures, a woman in a blue dress that looked like it was from the 1940s, turned and looked directly at me. She had kind eyes and a gentle expression, and she raised her hand in what appeared to be a friendly wave. When I instinctively waved back, she smiled and gestured for me to come closer, as if she wanted to tell me something important. I started walking toward the woman, but my father immediately grabbed my hand and asked where I was going. When I explained that the nice lady in the blue dress had waved at me and wanted me to come over, he looked in that direction with a concerned expression. He knelt down to my eye level and asked me to describe exactly what I was seeing, with the kind of serious attention that adults usually reserved for important conversations. I described the woman in the blue dress, the other figures scattered throughout Section D, and the way they all seemed to be floating just above the snow without leaving any footprints. My father listened carefully, occasionally asking questions about specific details, but never dismissing my account or telling me that I was imagining things. When I finished my description, he was quiet for a long moment, looking thoughtfully across the cemetery grounds. Finally, he told me that some places hold memories more strongly than others, and that children sometimes see things that adults can no longer perceive. He explained that Mountain View Cemetery had been serving the Boulder community for over 80 years, and that many people had said goodbye to their loved ones in this peaceful place. Sometimes, he said, when conditions are just right, those memories become visible to people who are open to seeing them. He asked me if the figures seemed frightening or threatening, and I told him that they appeared sad but peaceful, like they were visiting the cemetery for the same reasons that living people visited. The woman in the blue dress continued to watch me throughout this conversation, and she no longer seemed to be gesturing for me to approach. Instead, she appeared to be listening to my conversation with my father, nodding occasionally as if she approved of his explanations. As the afternoon light began to fade and the temperature dropped even further, the figures in Section D became less distinct and more translucent. By the time my father finished his damage assessment and we prepared to leave the cemetery, most of them had faded away entirely. Only the woman in the blue dress remained visible, and she stood beside a headstone that I could now read clearly. Fiona Martinez, 1903 to 1945, beloved mother and teacher. Before we left Mountain View Cemetery that day, my father walked with me to Fiona's grave. The headstone was simple but well maintained, and someone had left a small, bouquet of artificial flowers that were now partially covered with snow. My father explained that Fiona had been an elementary school teacher in Boulder for over 20 years, and that she had taught hundreds of children before her death from pneumonia in 1945. As we stood beside her grave, I could still see Fiona's figure, though she was becoming fainter as the daylight disappeared. She looked at me one final time, smiled warmly, and then slowly faded away until there was nothing left except the snow-covered headstone and the quiet peace of the winter cemetery. My father squeezed my hand and told me that I had been very lucky to see something that most people never experience in their entire lives. On the drive home, my father made me promise not to tell my mother about what I'd seen, explaining that she wouldn't understand and might worry unnecessarily about my mental state. He said that what I'd experienced was special and rare, but that most adults had forgotten how to see the world the way children do. This would be our secret, he said, something that we shared because of our special connection to Mountain View Cemetery. Over the next few years, I occasionally saw figures in the cemetery when I accompanied my father to work, but never again with the clarity and detail of that December afternoon. As I got older and became more focused on typical childhood concerns like school and friends, the ability seemed to fade gradually until I couldn't see anything unusual at all. By the time I was 12, Mountain View Cemetery looked like nothing more than a collection of headstones and landscaping. My father retired from his groundskeeper position when I was 16, and we rarely visited Mountain View Cemetery after that. But whenever I drive past it now as an adult, I think about that snowy December day when I was 8 years old and saw Fiona and the other peaceful spirits who continue to visit the place where their earthly bodies rest. I've never told anyone about this experience except my wife, and she listens patiently, but with the kind of skeptical expression that adults wear when they're trying to be polite about something they don't really believe. That's my story, and I'm sharing it because I want people to know that children sometimes see things that adults dismiss as imagination or fantasy. Mountain View Cemetery gave me a glimpse into a reality that exists alongside our everyday world, populated by people who love this place enough in life that they continue to visit it in whatever form they can manage. I was 8 years old when I learned that death might not be as final as we think, and that some connections to the places and people we love transcend the boundaries between life and whatever comes after. Let's move to our 6th story. My name is Trinity, and I'm a 73-year-old widow who has been visiting Greenwood Cemetery in Phoenix, Arizona every Tuesday afternoon for the past 3 years. My husband Hamza passed away in November 2022, and maintaining a regular schedule of visits to his grave has become the most important ritual in my life. At my age, routines provide comfort and structure, and the 2 hours I spend at Greenwood each week give me a sense of connection to the man I shared 47 years of marriage with. Phoenix in late summer can be brutally hot, but I've learned to time my visits for 2 p.m. when the desert sun is at its most intense. Most people would consider this poor planning, but I prefer the cemetery when it's empty of other visitors. The extreme heat drives everyone else indoors, leaving me alone with Hamza and the peaceful silence that only comes when you're the only living person in a place dedicated to the dead. I always wear the same black dress, the one I wore to his funeral, and I carry the same small bouquet of artificial flowers that won't wilt in the Arizona heat. My routine never varies. I park in the same spot near the main entrance, walk the same path through the newer section where Hamza rests, and spend exactly 90 minutes sitting beside his headstone talking about my week, sharing neighborhood gossip, and reading aloud from the newspaper articles I think he would have found interesting. Then I replace the previous week's flowers with fresh ones, say a prayer, and drive home in time to prepare dinner for one instead of 2. 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday that felt even hotter than usual, I noticed something different about my visit that initially seemed like a small blessing. As I sat beside Hamza's grave, reading him an article about the local baseball team's disappointing season, I heard his voice respond with a comment about the team's terrible pitching. For just a moment, it felt completely natural, like the thousands of conversations we'd had over nearly 5 decades together. But then reality crashed back, and I realized what had just happened. I had distinctly heard Hamza speak, not as a memory or imagination, but as clearly as if he were sitting right beside me on the small folding chair I always brought for my visits. His voice had come from somewhere to my left, from the direction of a large granite headstone about 10 feet away from his burial site. The comment about the pitching had been delivered in his characteristic dry humor, with the exact intonation and timing that had made me fall in love with him in 1975. I turned toward the sound, but saw nothing except the empty cemetery stretching out under the blazing sun. The headstone where his voice seemed to originate belonged to someone named Aubrey, who had died in 2019 at the age of 68. I stared at that spot for several minutes, waiting for some explanation or repetition of the phenomenon, but heard only the distant hum of traffic from the main road that runs along the cemetery's southern border. For the rest of that visit, I continued reading to Hamza in a normal voice, but I found myself listening intently for any response. When I finished the newspaper and began my usual update about my week, I mentioned how the air conditioning repair had cost more than expected and how the neighbor's dog had been barking all night again. As I complained about the dog, I heard Hamza chuckle softly and make a comment about how that same neighbor had always been inconsiderate, even when we first moved to the neighborhood 15 years ago. This time, I was ready for the sound, and I could pinpoint its location more precisely. Hamza's voice was definitely coming from the area around Aubrey's grave, but it sounded like he was speaking from underground, as if his words were traveling up through the earth itself. The voice was unmistakably his, with the same warmth and humor that had sustained our marriage through decades of shared joys and sorrows. I finished my visit that day feeling confused but oddly comforted. Grief counselors had warned me that hearing a deceased spouse's voice was a common part of the mourning process, especially during the first few years after loss. But this hadn't felt like a hallucination or wishful thinking. Hamza's responses had been conversational and appropriate, reacting to specific things I'd said rather than just echoing memories from our past. The following Tuesday, I arrived at Greenwood Cemetery with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Part of me hoped to hear Hamza's voice again, while another part worried that the previous week's experience had been a sign of deteriorating mental health. I'd spent the intervening days researching auditory hallucinations and grief-related psychological phenomena, trying to find rational explanations for what I'd experienced. I settled into my usual routine, reading Hamza the weekly news and updating him on my activities. When I mentioned that I'd finally decided to sell his vintage coin collection, his voice immediately responded with mock indignation, asking why I would get rid of something he'd spent 30 years carefully assembling. The response was so perfectly characteristic of his personality that I found myself smiling despite the impossibility of the situation. But this week, Hamza's voice wasn't coming from Aubrey's grave. Instead, it seemed to be originating from a different headstone, one belonging to Ridge, who had died in 2020. As our conversation continued, I realized that Hamza's voice was moving around the cemetery, responding from different grave sites as if he were walking from place to place while we talked. Over the next hour, I heard his voice coming from at least 6 different locations throughout the immediate area around his own grave. Sometimes, he sounded close, as if he were standing just a few feet away. Other times, his voice seemed more distant, as if he were calling to me from across a large room. But regardless of the apparent location, his responses remained perfectly timed and contextually appropriate to our conversation. The most disturbing moment came when I mentioned that I'd been having trouble sleeping and had been considering moving to a smaller apartment. Hamza's voice, now seeming to come from directly beneath my folding chair, urgently told me not to make any major decisions while I was still grieving. He said he was worried about me being alone and making choices that I might regret later. The concern in his voice was so genuine and immediate that I found myself responding aloud, assuring him that I wouldn't rush into anything important. As I prepared to leave that day, I decided to test whether Hamza could hear me when I wasn't speaking directly to his grave. I walked over to Aubrey's headstone and quietly said his name. Immediately, his voice responded from somewhere near the cemetery's main road, asking what I needed and whether I was ready to go home. When I walked toward Ridge's grave and whispered a question about what he thought of my new haircut, Hamza's voice came from an entirely different direction, complimenting the style and saying it made me look younger. This pattern continued for the next several weeks. Every Tuesday, I would have long, detailed conversations with Hamza while his voice moved around Greenwood Cemetery, sometimes seeming to come from specific graves and other times appearing to originate from empty spaces between headstones. He would comment on current events, offer advice about practical matters, and even reminisce about happy memories from our marriage. But last Tuesday, something happened that transformed my comforting conversations with Hamza into something far more frightening and confusing. As I was telling him about a phone call I'd received from our daughter in California, his voice interrupted me with unusual urgency. Instead of coming from one of the nearby graves, Hamza seemed to be speaking from directly beneath the ground where I was sitting. He told me that I needed to stop coming to the cemetery, that my visits were preventing him from resting properly. His voice sounded strained and distressed in a way I'd never heard during our 47 years together. He explained that every Tuesday when I came to talk to him, it pulled him back from wherever he was supposed to be, forcing him to return to a place and a state of existence that caused him pain. The worst part was when he told me that he wasn't the only one being disturbed by my visits. According to Hamza, my weekly conversations were somehow affecting other people buried in Greenwood Cemetery, pulling them back from their rest and creating a disturbance that rippled throughout the entire burial ground. He said that Aubrey and Ridge, whose graves his voice had been coming from, were particularly upset about being used as conduits for our conversations. Hamza begged me to say goodbye and stop visiting his grave, explaining that my love and devotion, while beautiful, were creating a kind of supernatural disturbance that was harming not just him, but dozens of other souls trying to find peace in death. He said that the most loving thing I could do would be to let him go completely, to find ways to honor his memory that didn't require pulling him back to a world he was no longer part of. I left Greenwood Cemetery that day, feeling more alone and confused than I had since the day Hamza died. For 3 weeks, our conversations had provided comfort and connection that made my grief bearable. Now I was being told that this comfort came at the cost of his peace and the peace of others who had found rest in death. That was my final visit to Hamza's grave. It's been a week since that last conversation, and I haven't returned to Greenwood Cemetery. The silence in my life feels overwhelming without our Tuesday talks, but I can't ignore his request to let him rest. If my love was somehow trapping him in a state between life and death, then the most loving thing I can do is respect his need for peace. I've started volunteering at the local senior center instead, channeling my need to care for others into helping people who are still among the living. But every Tuesday at 2 p.m., I find myself thinking about Greenwood Cemetery and wondering if Hamza has found the rest he was seeking. Sometimes I catch myself starting to tell him about my day, before remembering that our conversations must remain one-sided now, carried on in the privacy of my own heart rather than spoken aloud among the graves. That's my story, and I'm sharing it because I want other grieving spouses to understand that love can sometimes become a burden to those we've lost. Greenwood Cemetery taught me that even the most well-intentioned devotion can interfere with the natural process of death and whatever comes after. Sometimes the greatest act of love is learning when to let go, even when letting go feels like losing the person all over again. Let's move to our 7th story. My name is Tony, and I've worked as a groundskeeper at Oak Hill Cemetery in Rochester, New York for the past 12 years. In my line of work, you develop a certain rhythm and understanding of how cemeteries operate. I know which sections require the most maintenance, which families visit regularly, and which graves receive fresh flowers every week. I understand the seasonal patterns of burials, the way weather affects the grounds, and the natural settling process that occurs as time passes. What I experienced 3 months ago challenged everything I thought I knew about the cemetery I've been caring for over a decade. October in Rochester brings beautiful autumn colors, but also the first serious frosts of the season. The maple and oak trees that line Oak Hill's pathways create stunning displays of red and gold leaves. But they also require constant maintenance as those leaves fall and accumulate around headstones and monuments. It's one of my busiest times of year, requiring early morning rounds to clear pathways and ensure that grave markers remain visible and accessible to visiting families. I always start my workday at 6 a.m., arriving before the cemetery officially opens to the public. The early morning hours are peaceful and productive, allowing me to complete heavy maintenance tasks without disturbing visitors or interfering with funeral services. On October 15th, a Tuesday that dawned clear and cold with frost covering everything, I followed my usual routine of checking the newer sections first, before working my way back to the historical areas where the most labor-intensive cleanup typically occurs. Oak Hill Cemetery is organized in a grid system, with sections labeled alphabetically and numbered plots within each section. I keep detailed records of my maintenance activities, noting which areas need attention and tracking the completion of various projects throughout the grounds. This systematic approach helps me ensure that no section gets neglected and provides documentation for my supervisor and the cemetery board. About 2 hours into my morning rounds, I reached Section M, an area that contains graves from the 1980s through the present day. It's generally one of the easier sections to maintain because the newer headstones are more durable, and the families often handle much of the decorative maintenance themselves. As I approached the central area of Section M with my rake and leaf collection bags, I stopped short and stared at something that made absolutely no sense. There, scattered throughout Section M, were at least a dozen freshly excavated holes in the ground. Each hole was perfectly rectangular, exactly the size and depth of a standard burial plot. And they appeared to have been dug with professional precision. The soil from each excavation was piled neatly beside the corresponding hole, as if someone had carefully followed proper cemetery protocols for preparing new burial sites. But here's what made the situation impossible. According to my records and the cemetery's official burial schedule, no new interments were planned for Section M. In fact, most of the plots in that section had been sold and occupied years ago, with only a few scattered spaces remaining for future use. Yet there they were, perfectly dug graves in locations that should have contained existing burials or been designated as unused plots. I pulled out my maintenance log and cemetery map to double-check the plot numbers and locations. Every single freshly dug hole corresponded to a grave site that, according to official records, had been occupied for years. Plot M47 had been the burial site of Michelle since 1998. Plot M52 had contained the remains of Colton since 2001. Plot M63 had been home to the Willis family memorial since 2005. Yet there were the holes, empty and freshly excavated, as if these people had never been buried there at all. I walked carefully around the perimeter of each hole, examining the excavation work and looking for any explanation of how this could have occurred without my knowledge. The digging had been done with professional equipment, showing the clean vertical sides and uniform depth that comes from using a backhoe or similar machinery. But there were no equipment tracks in the grass, no tire marks or disturbed earth outside the immediate area of each hole. Even more disturbing was the fact that I had personally worked in Section M just 3 days earlier, clearing fallen leaves and performing routine maintenance. At that time, every grave had been intact and normal, with headstones in their proper positions and no signs of any disturbance. The transformation of this section from a normal cemetery area to what looked like a mass grave excavation site had happened over a single weekend, apparently without anyone noticing or reporting the activity. I immediately called my supervisor Jake on my cell phone, explaining the situation and requesting that he come to the cemetery immediately. While waiting for him to arrive, I continued my inspection of Section M and made an even more unsettling discovery. The headstones for all the supposedly excavated graves were still in their original positions, looking exactly as they had for years. The engraved names, dates, and epitaphs were clearly visible and unchanged, but they now stood at the head of empty holes instead of marking actual burial sites. Jake arrived within 30 minutes, bringing the cemetery's master records and a digital camera to document what we were seeing. He had worked at Oak Hill Cemetery for over 20 years and had never encountered anything remotely similar to this situation. Together, we verified that each excavated plot corresponded to a documented burial, complete with death certificates, burial permits, and payment records dating back years or even decades. Jake called the cemetery director, who arrived with a representative from the funeral home that handles most of Oak Hill's services. They brought ground-penetrating radar equipment to scan the excavated areas and determine whether any remains were actually present below ground level. The results were conclusive and deeply troubling. The radar detected no evidence of caskets, burial vaults, or human remains in any of the freshly dug holes. But the most disturbing discovery came when we expanded our investigation beyond Section M. Walking through adjacent sections with the ground-penetrating radar, we found that several other graves throughout the cemetery showed similar anomalies. Plots that had been occupied for years, according to official records, showed no underground evidence of burial, while some supposedly empty plots registered clear evidence of interment. The cemetery director decided to excavate one of the officially empty plots that showed radar evidence of burial, hoping to understand what was happening at Oak Hill Cemetery. What we found defied all logical explanation. 6 feet down, in a plot that had never been sold or used according to our records, we discovered a concrete burial vault containing a casket with the remains of someone who had apparently been buried there for many years. The casket bore a nameplate reading, Morgan, 1934 to 1987. But we had no record of anyone by that name ever being interred at Oak Hill Cemetery. The burial vault was properly installed and showed signs of having been in place for decades. Yet our comprehensive records going back to the cemetery's founding contained no mention of Morgan or any burial in that specific plot location. Over the next week, we conducted a systematic investigation of the entire cemetery using ground-penetrating radar and selective excavation. The results revealed a pattern that challenged everything we understood about Oak Hill Cemetery's history and record-keeping. Dozens of graves that should have contained remains were completely empty, while numerous, supposedly unused plots contained evidence of burials that had never been officially documented. The most unsettling aspect of the investigation was that the physical evidence seemed to shift from day to day. Holes that had been freshly excavated on Tuesday morning would be filled with normal earth by Wednesday evening, showing no signs of recent disturbance. Headstones that had marked empty holes would return to their positions above what appeared to be properly interred remains. The ground-penetrating radar readings changed daily, as if the underground contents of Oak Hill Cemetery were constantly reorganizing themselves. Local authorities became involved when we reported the situation, but their investigation yielded no evidence of criminal activity or unauthorized excavation. Security cameras positioned throughout the cemetery showed no unusual activity during the time frame when the changes occurred. No equipment had been brought onto the grounds, no personnel had accessed the cemetery outside of normal operating hours, and no permits had been issued for any excavation work. The incidents stopped as suddenly as they had begun. After 2 weeks of daily monitoring and investigation, Oak Hill Cemetery returned to normal operation, with all graves appearing properly maintained and all records corresponding to physical evidence. The freshly excavated holes were gone, the missing remains were apparently back in their proper locations, and the ground-penetrating radar readings matched our official burial records. But the experience left me with profound questions about the nature of burial grounds and the permanence of death itself. For 12 years, I had maintained Oak Hill Cemetery under the assumption that buried remains stay buried, that grave markers indicate the actual location of interred bodies, and that cemetery records provide reliable documentation of who rests where. The events of October 2025 shattered those assumptions completely. I still work at Oak Hill Cemetery, and I still follow the same maintenance routines that have served me well for over a decade. But now I approach my daily rounds with a different understanding of the place I'm caring for. Sometimes, when the morning frost covers the headstones and the autumn mist rises from the ground, I wonder if the people buried here are truly at rest, or if they're engaged in some kind of eternal movement that living humans can only occasionally witness. My union held a meeting about the working conditions at Oak Hill Cemetery, and several other groundskeepers shared similar experiences from their own work sites. Apparently, the phenomenon of graves appearing to relocate or change contents isn't entirely uncommon in cemetery work, but it's rarely discussed openly because it challenges the fundamental assumptions that our profession is built upon. I've documented everything I experienced in detailed reports that are filed with the cemetery administration, but I doubt anyone will believe such an impossible account. The physical evidence has returned to normal. The official records match the current state of the grounds, and there's no way to prove that dozens of graves spent 2 weeks in the wrong locations, or that buried remains temporarily relocated themselves throughout Oak Hill Cemetery. That's my story, and I'm sharing it because I believe that people who work closely with places of burial sometimes witness phenomena that can't be explained by conventional understanding of death and interment. Oak Hill Cemetery appears peaceful and well-maintained to the families who visit. But those of us who care for these grounds know that there are mysteries buried here that go far deeper than 6 feet underground. Mysteries that remind us that death might not be as final or as static as we prefer to believe. Let's move to our 8th story. My name is Ashley, and when I was 17 years old, I made the worst decision of my life by agreeing to participate in an overnight dare at Hillcrest Memorial Gardens in Kansas City, Missouri. What started as typical teenage rebellion against parental authority turned into a nightmare that cost me 3 of my closest friends and left me with questions that I've never been able to answer. Even now, 8 years later. It was mid-November 2017, and my senior year of high school was progressing with the usual mix of college applications, part-time jobs, and weekend parties that defined life in suburban Kansas City. I was part of a tight group of 4 friends who had known each other since middle school. Myself, Jessica, Brandon, and Tyler. We considered ourselves more adventurous and mature than our classmates, always looking for experiences that would set us apart from what we saw as the boring conformity of high school social life. The dare originated from a conversation we'd been having about local urban legends and supposedly haunted locations around Kansas City. Hillcrest Memorial Gardens had a reputation among teenagers as being one of the most haunted cemeteries in the area, with stories of strange lights, unexplained sounds, and ghostly apparitions that had been passed down through generations of high school students. Most adults dismissed these stories as typical teenage folklore, but we were convinced that there had to be some truth behind the persistent rumors. Brandon, who always acted as the unofficial leader of our group, proposed that we spend an entire night in Hillcrest Memorial Gardens to prove once and for all that we were the best and for all whether the supernatural stories had any basis in reality. The plan was simple. We would enter the cemetery after midnight, set up a base camp near the center of the grounds, and document any paranormal activity we encountered using our phones and a digital camera that Jessica had borrowed from her photography class. We spent 2 weeks planning our overnight adventure, researching the cemetery's layout, identifying potential entry points, and gathering supplies we thought we might need. I remember feeling excited about the prospect of finally doing something that felt genuinely rebellious and adult, something that would give us stories to tell for years to come. None of us seriously believed we would encounter anything supernatural, but the possibility added an element of thrilling uncertainty to our plans. On the night of November 18th, we met at the parking lot of a 24-hour diner about a mile from Hillcrest Memorial Gardens. I had told my parents I was staying overnight at Jessica's house, while she had told her parents she was staying with me. Brandon and Tyler had used similar deceptions to avoid parental supervision. We were dressed warmly in dark clothing, carrying backpacks filled with snacks, water, flashlights, extra batteries, and sleeping bags for our overnight stay. The cemetery's main gates were locked after sunset, but we had identified a section of fence near the back of the property where the chain link had been damaged and could be easily climbed. Getting onto the grounds was surprisingly easy, and within 15 minutes of leaving the diner, we were walking through Hillcrest Memorial Gardens with only our flashlights to guide us through the darkness. The November night was cold but clear, with a half moon providing enough ambient light to see the outlines of headstones and monuments once our eyes adjusted to the darkness. We made our way toward the center of the cemetery, where an older section contained some of the most elaborate Victorian-era graves and mausoleums. This area seemed like the most likely location for supernatural activity, if such things actually existed. We set up our base camp near a large granite monument that provided some shelter from the wind and gave us a central location from which to explore different sections of the cemetery. Brandon had brought a detailed map of Hillcrest Memorial Gardens that he'd printed from the cemetery's website, and we used it to plan exploration routes that would take us through different areas throughout the night. For the first few hours, everything proceeded exactly as we had expected. We walked through various sections of the cemetery, taking photographs and recording video on our phones, telling ghost stories, and generally enjoying the thrill of being somewhere we weren't supposed to be after midnight. The cemetery was peaceful and quiet, with only the distant sound of traffic from the main road and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. Around 2 a.m., we decided to explore the older section near the back of the cemetery, where some of the headstones dated back to the 1800s, and the inscriptions were barely legible after decades of weather and neglect. This area felt different from the rest of Hillcrest Memorial Gardens, more isolated and somehow more oppressive. But we attributed these feelings to the late hour and our increasingly tired state. It was in this older section that we first noticed something unusual. As we walked among the weathered headstones, taking photographs and reading inscriptions aloud, we began to realize that our group was spreading out more than we had intended. What had started as a tight cluster of 4 friends exploring together had somehow become a more scattered formation, with each of us gravitating toward different areas of interest. I remember being fascinated by a particular headstone that commemorated a young woman who had died in 1892 at the age of 19, just 2 years older than I was at the time. As I knelt down to photograph the inscription, I called out to Jessica to come see what I'd found, but when I looked around, I couldn't see any of my friends. Their flashlight beams were visible in different directions, but they all seemed much farther away than they should have been. I stood up and called out to the group, suggesting that we regroup and head back toward our base camp. Brandon's voice responded from somewhere to my left, agreeing that it was time to take a break. Jessica's voice came from a completely different direction, saying she had found something interesting and wanted us to come see it. Tyler's voice seemed to come from directly behind me, asking if anyone else was getting cold and ready to head home. But here's what made the situation terrifying. As I turned toward Tyler's voice, I could see his flashlight beam in the distance, at least 100 yards away, in the opposite direction from where his voice had seemed to originate. When I called out this discrepancy, asking Tyler why his voice and his light didn't match up, there was no response. In fact, all of my friends seemed to have gone completely silent. I started walking toward where I had last seen Tyler's flashlight, calling out to all 3 of my friends and asking them to respond so we could regroup. But as I moved through the older section of the cemetery, the flashlight beams that had been visible just moments earlier seemed to be disappearing one by one. First Brandon's light went out, then Jessica's, then Tyler's, until I was standing alone in the darkness with only my own flashlight illuminating a small circle of weathered headstones and overgrown grass. I spent the next hour searching through Hillcrest Memorial Gardens, calling out my friends' names and retracing the routes we had taken earlier in the night. I checked our base camp near the granite monument, but their backpacks and sleeping bags were gone. I searched the perimeter fence where we had entered the cemetery, thinking they might have decided to leave and meet me at the car, but found no sign of them. By 4 a.m., I was genuinely frightened and beginning to consider that something had gone seriously wrong. I tried calling each of their cell phones, but every call went straight to voicemail. I sent text messages asking where they were and begging them to respond if this was some kind of prank, but received no replies. The batteries in my flashlight were beginning to weaken, and I was getting genuinely scared about being alone in the cemetery as dawn approached. I made the decision to leave Hillcrest Memorial Gardens and drive to the police station to report my missing friends. Climbing back over the damaged fence, I ran the mile back to the diner parking lot where we had left our cars. Jessica's car was gone, as was Brandon's truck and Tyler's motorcycle. Only my car remained in the otherwise empty lot, looking abandoned under the fluorescent lights of the diner's parking area. At the police station, I filed missing persons reports for all 3 of my friends, explaining that we had been exploring the cemetery together and that they had disappeared sometime after 2 a.m. The officers took my statement seriously, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes when I described how their voices had seemed to come from different locations than their flashlights, and how they had apparently vanished without a trace along with all their belongings. The police conducted a thorough search of Hillcrest Memorial Gardens the next day, using K-9 units and professional search equipment. They found no trace of Jessica, Brandon, or Tyler anywhere on the cemetery grounds. There were no signs of struggle, no abandoned personal items, and no evidence that they had ever been in the cemetery at all. despite my detailed account of our activities throughout the night. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded to include interviews with family members, searches of their homes and other locations they frequently visited, and analysis of their cell phone and social media activity. The last documented evidence of their existence was security camera footage from a gas station near the diner, showing all four of us purchasing snacks and drinks around 11 p.m. on November 18th. After that, it was as if three of my closest friends had simply ceased to exist. Jessica's parents hired a private investigator, and Brandon's family organized volunteer search parties that combed through wooded areas and abandoned buildings throughout Kansas City. Tyler's motorcycle was never found, despite being a distinctive custom bike that should have been easily recognizable. None of their personal belongings ever surfaced. None of their financial accounts showed any activity, and none of the social media monitoring that their family set up ever detected any sign of their continued existence. The case attracted some media attention, partly because of the unusual circumstances and partly because three teenagers disappearing simultaneously was unprecedented in Kansas City's recent history. I appeared on local news programs and gave interviews to reporters, always maintaining that my friends had vanished while we were exploring Hillcrest Memorial Gardens together. But I could see the doubt in people's expressions, the unspoken questions about whether I was telling the truth or concealing some darker explanation for their disappearance. 8 years later, Jessica, Brandon, and Tyler remain missing persons with no new leads or evidence. I graduated from high school alone, attended college in a different state to escape the constant questions and suspicion, and have built an adult life that exists in the shadow of that November night in 2017. I've never returned to Hillcrest Memorial Gardens, and I avoid driving past the cemetery when I visit Kansas City to see my family. But sometimes, late at night when I'm having trouble sleeping, I receive text messages from numbers I don't recognize. The messages are always brief and cryptic, still exploring, or found something interesting, or getting cold, ready to head home. When I try to call these numbers back, they're always disconnected. When I show the messages to other people, they insist that my phone screen shows no recent text activity. That's my story, and I'm sharing it because I want people to understand that some places can separate friends in ways that go beyond physical distance or normal explanation. Hillcrest Memorial Gardens looks like an ordinary cemetery during daylight hours, peaceful and well-maintained. But something in that older section has the power to divide groups and make people disappear in ways that leave no trace for investigators or search teams to follow. I lost my 3 best friends to whatever exists in those grounds, and I've spent 8 years wondering if they're still out there somewhere, still exploring, still searching for something they'll never find. Let's move to our 9th story. My name is Kylan, and I'm a historian specializing in colonial American burial practices and cemetery preservation. For the past 15 years, I've traveled throughout the eastern United States documenting historical burial grounds and researching the cultural significance of early American death rituals. My work has taken me to some of the oldest and most historically significant cemeteries in the country. But nothing in my academic background prepared me for what I experienced at Colonial Cemetery in Williamsburg, Virginia last March. I had received a research grant from the University of Virginia to conduct a comprehensive study of Colonial Cemetery, which contains graves dating back to 1695 and represents one of the most complete collections of early American burial artifacts on the East Coast. The cemetery had been closed to public access for several years due to deteriorating conditions and security concerns. But my academic credentials and research proposal had secured me special permission to spend 2 weeks documenting the site and analyzing the historical significance of its monuments and inscriptions. Colonial Cemetery occupies 12 acres in the heart of historic Williamsburg, surrounded by the restored buildings and carefully maintained landscapes that attract millions of tourists each year. But unlike the polished tourist attractions nearby, the cemetery had been allowed to return to a more natural state, with ancient oak trees creating a canopy over weathered headstones and crumbling family vaults that hadn't been maintained in decades. I arrived in Williamsburg on March 8th and spent my first 3 days in the cemetery conducting preliminary surveys and establishing a systematic approach to documenting the more than 2,000 burial markers scattered throughout the grounds. The work was methodical and peaceful, requiring hours of careful measurement, photography, and transcription of inscriptions that had been carved into stone nearly 3 centuries ago. The colonial period burial markers were fascinating from both historical and artistic perspectives. Many featured elaborate death's head motifs, winged cherubs, and religious imagery that reflected the complex relationship early Americans had with death and the afterlife. The inscriptions provided glimpses into family structures, causes of death, and social hierarchies that helped illuminate daily life in colonial Virginia. On my 4th day in the cemetery, while documenting a particularly ornate family vault from 1742, I began to notice something unusual about the way sounds carried through the grounds. Colonial Cemetery had always been remarkably quiet, insulated from the tourist activity in nearby Williamsburg by its heavy tree cover and secluded location. But as I worked among the older graves, I started hearing what sounded like conversations taking place in different areas of the cemetery. At first, I assumed that other researchers or maintenance workers were conducting their own activities in sections of the cemetery that I couldn't see from my current location. The voices were indistinct and seemed to come from considerable distances, so I didn't pay much attention to them initially. But as the afternoon progressed, I began to realize that the conversations I was hearing had an odd, formal quality that seemed out of place for casual work-related discussions. The voices spoke in what sounded like archaic English, with pronunciation patterns and vocabulary that reminded me of colonial period documents I had studied in my research. Phrases like "pray tell" and "God willing" carried clearly across the cemetery grounds, along with references to activities and concerns that seemed more appropriate to the 18th century than to modern academic work. Curious about who else might be conducting period-appropriate research in Colonial Cemetery, I decided to investigate the source of these conversations. Following the sound of voices through the older section of the cemetery, I made my way toward what appeared to be a gathering of people near a cluster of family vaults that dated to the mid-1700s. As I approached the area where the conversations seemed to be taking place, the voices became clearer and more distinct. But what I heard made no logical sense in the context of modern historical research. The people speaking were discussing harvest schedules, concerns about British taxation policies, and local gossip about families whose names I recognized from colonial period documents, but who had died centuries ago. When I reached the cluster of family vaults where the voices seemed to originate, I found myself standing alone among weathered stone monuments and overgrown vegetation. There was no sign of any other people in the immediate area, yet I could still hear the conversations continuing as clearly as if the speakers were standing right beside me. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was that the voices seemed to be responding to my presence. As I stood among the colonial graves, trying to locate the source of the conversations, I heard someone mention the scholarly gentleman who has come to record our resting places and express hope that our stories might be preserved for future generations. I tried calling out to identify myself and explain my research project, thinking that perhaps other historians were conducting some kind of living history demonstration that I hadn't been informed about. But when I spoke, the conversation stopped immediately, leaving only the natural sounds of wind through the oak trees and distant traffic from the streets surrounding the cemetery. The silence lasted for several minutes before the voices resumed. But now they seemed to be discussing my presence directly. I heard references to the visitor from the modern time, and speculation about whether I possessed the sensitivity to perceive those who have passed beyond the veil. The speakers seemed to be debating among themselves about whether they should attempt more direct communication with me. Over the next several days, these encounters with historical voices became a regular part of my research routine. Every afternoon, as I worked among the colonial graves, I would hear conversations that seemed to involve the actual people buried in Colonial Cemetery, discussing their lives, their deaths, and their observations of the changing world around their burial ground. The voices provided historical details that weren't available in any written records I had access to. They spoke about daily life in colonial Williamsburg, described family relationships and community conflicts that had never been documented, and shared perspectives on historical events that I had only read about in formal accounts written by political and religious leaders. Most remarkably, the voices seemed eager to help with my research project. They would direct my attention to graves that contained particularly significant historical information, point out inscriptions that had been worn away by weather but were still important to understanding family histories, and provide context for burial practices that had puzzled historians for decades. I began taking detailed notes of these conversations, documenting not only the historical information they provided, but also the linguistic patterns and cultural references that gave insights into how colonial Americans actually spoke and thought. The voices used vocabulary and grammatical structures that were consistent with colonial period documents, but with a natural, conversational quality that formal written records rarely captured. But the most extraordinary experience occurred during my second week in Colonial Cemetery, when the voices began describing their own burial ceremonies in vivid detail. I learned about funeral practices that had never been documented in historical records, heard accounts of family grief and community mourning rituals, and gained insights into colonial attitudes toward death that completely changed my understanding of early American culture. One voice, belonging to someone who identified himself as a merchant who had died during a yellow fever epidemic in 1763, described the experience of being buried while still partially conscious, aware of the funeral ceremony taking place above his grave, but unable to communicate his condition to the mourners. He explained that this traumatic experience had left him connected to the physical world in a way that other spirits were not, allowing him to observe the centuries of changes that had occurred around Colonial Cemetery. Another voice, that of a young woman who had died in childbirth in 1729, shared detailed accounts of family structures and women's roles in colonial society that provided insights no historian had ever documented. She described the social pressures and medical practices that had contributed to her death, but also expressed gratitude that her burial in Colonial Cemetery had allowed her to maintain connections to the community she had loved in life. These conversations continued throughout my 2 weeks in Williamsburg, providing me with more genuine historical insight than I had gained in 15 years of traditional academic research. The voices shared information about colonial life that was intimate, personal, and completely authentic, offering perspectives that no written document could provide. But on my final day in Colonial Cemetery, the voices delivered a warning that changed my understanding of the entire experience. They explained that my ability to hear their conversations was a rare gift that came with significant responsibility. According to the spirits I had been communicating with, most people who possess this sensitivity eventually become overwhelmed by the constant presence of historical voices and lose their connection to the living world. They warned me that continuing to seek out these supernatural historical encounters could result in my becoming permanently trapped between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, unable to function in either reality. The colonial spirits expressed genuine concern for my well-being and urged me to limit my exposure to places where the past maintained such a strong presence. I left Williamsburg with notebooks full of historical information that would revolutionize colonial studies, but also with a profound understanding of the dangers associated with my newfound ability to communicate with historical spirits. The research grant had provided me with invaluable insights into colonial American culture, but it had also revealed that some forms of historical research come with risks that extend far beyond academic careers. I've published several papers based on my research at Colonial Cemetery, though I've been careful to present the information I gathered as the result of traditional archival research rather than supernatural communication. The historical community has praised the depth and authenticity of my insights into colonial life, but I've never revealed the true source of this knowledge. Since returning from Williamsburg, I've noticed that my sensitivity to historical voices has continued to develop. I now hear similar conversations at other historic sites I visit, and I've had to limit my research to more recent time periods to avoid becoming completely overwhelmed by contact with the dead. That's my story, and I'm sharing it because I believe that some people possess natural abilities to connect with historical periods in ways that transcend traditional research methods. Colonial Cemetery gave me access to authentic historical voices that provided insights no academic study could offer, but it also taught me that there are boundaries between past and present that shouldn't be crossed without understanding the potential consequences for both the living and the dead. Let's move to our 10th story. My name is Matilda, and I'm a funeral director who has been working in the death care industry for over 20 years. Throughout my career, I've helped thousands of families through their most difficult moments, coordinating everything from simple cremations to elaborate traditional burials. I thought I had seen every possible aspect of death and grief until last summer, when I encountered something at Restwood Memorial Park in Portland, Oregon that challenged everything I understood about the finality of burial and the peace that families expect their loved ones to find in death. In July 2025, I received a call from the Martinez family about arranging burial services for their patriarch, Amiri, who had passed away at the age of 87 after a long battle with cancer. Amiri had been a respected member of Portland's Latino community, a veteran who had served in Vietnam, and a father of 6 children who wanted to honor his memory with a traditional Catholic funeral followed by burial in the family plot at Restwood Memorial Park. The Martinez family had purchased a 4-plot section in Restwood Memorial Park 15 years earlier, anticipating that it would eventually serve as the final resting place for Amiri and his wife Liliana, along with space for future family members if needed. Amiri's burial would be the first use of their family section, located in a newer area of the cemetery that featured well-maintained grounds and beautiful landscaping with mature pine trees and seasonal flower gardens. I had worked with the Martinez family on funeral arrangements for extended family members in the past, so they were familiar with my approach to providing dignified, culturally sensitive services that honored both their religious traditions and their personal preferences. Amiri's funeral was scheduled for a Saturday morning in late July, with a Catholic Mass at their parish church followed by a procession to Restwood Memorial Park for the burial ceremony. The funeral service proceeded exactly as planned, with over 200 family members and friends gathering to celebrate Amiri's life and offer support to Liliana and their children. The procession to Restwood Memorial Park was respectful and orderly, with the hearse leading a long line of vehicles through the cemetery's main entrance to the family's burial section. The weather was perfect for an outdoor ceremony, warm but not too hot, with a gentle breeze rustling through the pine trees. At the graveside, Father Boone conducted a beautiful ceremony that included traditional Catholic prayers readings from scripture, and personal eulogies from Amiri's children that brought both tears and smiles from the gathered mourners. The military honor guard performed a flag-folding ceremony that recognized Amiri's service in Vietnam, and the casket was lowered into the ground with the dignity and reverence that the family had requested. After the ceremony concluded and the family had said their final goodbyes, I remained at the graveside to oversee the burial completion and ensure that everything was properly finished according to both cemetery regulations and the family's wishes. This is standard practice in my profession, as families shouldn't have to witness the mechanical aspects of filling the grave and installing the temporary marker that would remain until the permanent headstone was ready. The cemetery crew began filling Amiri's grave with the careful, respectful approach that Restwood Memorial Park was known for, using equipment that minimized noise and working efficiently to restore the site to a condition that would provide comfort to visiting family members. I stood nearby, completing paperwork and coordinating with the cemetery office about the timeline for installing Amiri's permanent memorial marker. About 30 minutes after the family had departed, as the grave-filling process neared completion, I began to hear something that made me stop writing and listen carefully to sounds coming from the burial site. It was faint at first, barely audible over the noise of the cemetery equipment, but it seemed like someone was calling for help from underground. The sound was muffled and distant, but unmistakably human, coming from the direction of Amiri's freshly filled grave. I asked the cemetery crew to shut down their equipment for a moment so I could listen more carefully to what I was hearing. In the sudden silence, the sound became clearer and more urgent. Someone was definitely calling out from beneath the ground, speaking in Spanish and asking for assistance. The voice was elderly and weak, but clearly distressed, and it seemed to be coming from directly below the spot where Amiri had just been buried. My first thought was that there had been a terrible mistake, that Amiri had somehow been buried while still alive. Despite the fact that I had personally verified his death with multiple medical professionals and had overseen his preparation for burial over the course of 3 days. But the voice calling from underground was unmistakably real, and my professional responsibility was to ensure that no one was buried alive under any circumstances. I immediately called 911 and requested emergency excavation equipment, explaining that we had a potential burial emergency at Restwood Memorial Park. The dispatcher seemed confused by the nature of the emergency, but agreed to send fire department rescue units, along with paramedics who were trained in confined space rescue operations. I also called the cemetery director and explained that we needed to excavate Amiri's grave immediately to investigate reports of someone calling for help from underground. While waiting for emergency responders to arrive, I continued to hear the voice calling from Amiri's grave, sometimes in Spanish and sometimes in English, consistently asking for help and expressing confusion about being trapped underground. The cemetery crew was visibly shaken by the situation, as none of them had ever encountered anything like this in their years of burial work. The fire department arrived within 20 minutes, bringing specialized equipment for emergency excavation and rescue operations. The paramedics set up their equipment while the firefighters began the careful process of excavating Amiri's grave, working quickly but methodically to avoid causing any additional trauma to whoever was trapped below ground. As the excavation progressed and the firefighters reached the level of Amiri's burial vault, the voice from underground became louder and more distinct. The person calling for help was definitely speaking from inside the concrete vault that contained Amiri's casket. But what they were saying made no logical sense given the circumstances of the burial. The voice was asking about Liliani, wanting to know if she was safe and whether their children had been properly notified about the funeral arrangements. The person underground seemed to be unaware that the funeral had already taken place, and that he had been buried hours earlier. Instead, he sounded confused and disoriented, as if he had just awakened from sleep and found himself trapped in an unfamiliar location. When the firefighters finally opened Amiri's burial vault, what they found defied every rational explanation I could construct. Amiri's casket was properly positioned and appeared to be undisturbed, but the voice calling for help was definitely coming from inside the casket itself. The emergency responders carefully opened the casket, expecting to find Amiri alive, but in need of immediate medical attention. What we discovered was Amiri's body, exactly as I had prepared it for burial, showing no signs of life or movement. He was clearly deceased, with the same peaceful expression he had worn during the funeral service. But the voice asking for help continued to come from the casket, even though Amiri's mouth wasn't moving and there was no physiological evidence that he was alive or capable of speech. The paramedics conducted every test they could think of to determine if Amiri was somehow still alive, checking for pulse, respiration, brain activity, and any other signs of life. Every test confirmed that he had been dead for several days and that there was no medical possibility of him being conscious or able to speak. Yet the voice continued, now asking the emergency responders who they were and requesting that someone contact his family to let them know he was all right. The firefighters and paramedics documented everything they observed, but none of them could provide any explanation for how a deceased person could be speaking clearly and coherently from inside a sealed casket. The voice showed no signs of distress about being dead or buried, instead expressing concern about normal everyday matters, like whether Liliana had remembered to take her medication and whether someone was taking care of their garden. After 2 hours of investigation, during which Amiri's voice continued to engage in normal conversation with the emergency responders, the decision was made to reseal the casket and complete the burial. The voice expressed no objection to this plan, instead thanking everyone for their concern and asking that they give his love to Liliana and the children when they saw them next. The grave was refilled and the site was restored to its proper condition. But Amiri's voice could still be heard faintly from underground, now seeming to carry on a phone conversation with someone, discussing plans for next weekend and expressing satisfaction that the funeral arrangements had gone smoothly. I filed detailed reports about the incident with both the Cemetery Administration and the State Funeral Director Licensing Board, but I've never received any official response or explanation for what occurred at Amiri's burial. The emergency responders included the incident in their official logs, but I suspect that most people who read those reports assume there was some kind of equipment malfunction or communication error that created the illusion of voices from underground. The Martinez family visited Amiri's grave the following week to leave flowers and say prayers, and Liliana mentioned that she felt a sense of peace and comfort at the burial site, as if Amiri was somehow still present and watching over the family. She said she had heard his voice in her dreams, reassuring her that he was fine and encouraging her to take care of herself and stay connected with their children and grandchildren. Over the following months, I received occasional reports from cemetery maintenance staff that Amiri's grave was sometimes the source of faint voices, usually during early morning hours when the cemetery was otherwise empty. The voices were always positive and conversational, never distressed or frightening, and they seemed to be focused on everyday family matters rather than concerns about death or burial. I've continued working as a funeral director, but the experience with Amiri Martinez fundamentally changed my understanding of what death means and whether burial truly represents the end of a person's connection to their family and community. I now approach every funeral with greater awareness that the people we bury might not be as disconnected from the living world as we assume, and that death might be a more complex transition than our profession typically acknowledges. Several other funeral directors in Portland have privately shared similar experiences with me, describing burials where the deceased seem to continue communicating with family members or expressing concern about unfinished business. These incidents are rarely reported officially because they challenge the fundamental assumptions that our entire industry is built upon. But they occur frequently enough to suggest that death might not be the absolute ending that most people believe it to be. That's my story, and I'm sharing it because I believe that people who work closely with death sometimes witness phenomena that can't be explained by medical science or religious doctrine. Amiri Martinez's burial taught me that some people remain connected to their families and communities even after death, continuing to offer comfort and guidance from beyond the grave in ways that bring peace to those they've left behind, even if those connections challenge everything we think we know about the finality of death and burial. Let's move to our final story. My name is Vincent, and I've spent the last 35 years working as a night security guard at various locations throughout Chicago, Illinois. In my line of work, you learn to distinguish between normal nighttime sounds and genuinely concerning disturbances. You develop an instinct for when something is out of place, when shadows don't fall the way they should, and when the familiar becomes unexpectedly threatening. But nothing in my decades of overnight security work prepared me for my final assignment at Graceland Cemetery, one of Chicago's most prestigious burial grounds, where I encountered something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the boundary between life and death. Graceland Cemetery is a sprawling 119-acre site on Chicago's north side that serves as the final resting place for some of the city's most prominent historical figures. Established in 1860, it contains elaborate mausoleums, stunning sculptures, and carefully maintained landscapes that make it as much a work of art as a burial ground. During daylight hours, Graceland attracts visitors who come to pay respects to famous residents or simply to appreciate the Victorian-era architecture and peaceful garden settings. I was hired as night security supervisor in September 2025, responsible for monitoring the cemetery from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. every night of the week. The position paid well because most security guards found cemetery work psychologically challenging, especially during the long winter months when darkness fell early and temperatures dropped below freezing. But I had spent decades working night shifts in hospitals, office buildings, and industrial facilities, so I welcomed the quiet, predictable environment that cemetery security typically provided. My duties were straightforward: conduct regular walking patrols throughout the cemetery grounds, monitor security cameras positioned at key locations, document any unusual activity or maintenance issues, and ensure that no unauthorized persons gained access to the property after closing hours. Graceland Cemetery had experienced occasional problems with vandalism and theft, so the board of directors had decided to invest in professional overnight security rather than relying solely on perimeter fencing and alarm systems. The security office was located in a small building near the main entrance, equipped with monitors showing feeds from dozen cameras positioned throughout the cemetery. I had a desk for completing reports, a coffee maker for staying alert during long nights, and a radio for communicating with Chicago police if any serious problems arose. The work was solitary but peaceful, allowing me to read or study during quiet periods between patrol rounds. For my first 3 weeks at Graceland Cemetery, everything proceeded exactly as I had expected. The overnight hours passed quietly, with only occasional visits from raccoons, possums, and other urban wildlife that used the cemetery as a safe refuge from the busy city surrounding it. I completed my patrol routes on schedule, filed routine reports about minor maintenance needs, and gradually familiarized myself with the layout of the extensive grounds and the locations of the most significant monuments and mausoleums. But during my 4th week in October, I began noticing something unusual during my late-night patrol rounds. As I walked through the older sections of Graceland Cemetery, I started seeing what appeared to be people standing near certain graves, always at a distance, and always in areas where the lighting was dim. At first, I assumed these were family members or friends who had somehow gained access to the cemetery after hours to visit deceased loved ones, perhaps climbing over fencing or finding gaps in the perimeter security. My protocol for handling after-hours visitors was to approach them politely, explain that the cemetery was closed, and escort them to the main entrance while documenting the incident for my supervisor. But every time I walked toward these figures to initiate contact, they seemed to disappear before I could reach them. I would see someone clearly silhouetted against a monument or headstone from 50 yards away. But when I arrived at that location, there would be no sign of any person having been there recently. After several nights of these encounters, I began to suspect that the figures I was seeing weren't unauthorized visitors, but something else entirely. They appeared to be wearing clothing from different historical periods, ranging from Victorian-era dresses and formal suits to more modern attire from the mid-20th century. Some seemed to be elderly, while others appeared younger, but all of them shared a translucent quality that made them visible, but not entirely solid. The figures never seemed threatening or aggressive. Instead, they appeared to be engaged in quiet, contemplative activities around specific grave sites. I observed them placing flowers on headstones, kneeling in prayer, or simply standing in respectful silence near monuments. Their behavior was consistent with typical cemetery visitors, except that they were present during hours when no living persons should have been on the grounds. As October progressed into November, these supernatural encounters became a regular part of my nightly routine. I would see the figures during each patrol round, always in different locations, but always engaged in peaceful activities that seemed connected to specific burial sites. I began documenting their appearances in my security reports, noting the times, locations, and apparent activities, though I was careful to describe them as possible unauthorized visitors, rather than explicitly supernatural phenomena. The most remarkable night occurred during the first week of November, when I encountered what appeared to be a gathering of these figures near the cemetery's central lake. As I approached the area during my 2 a.m. patrol round, I could see at least 20 people standing together in a loose circle, all wearing clothing from different historical periods, and all appearing to be participating in some kind of ceremonial activity. As I got closer to the gathering, I could hear what sounded like singing or chanting, though the words were indistinct and seemed to blend together in a harmonious but otherworldly melody. The figures appeared to be holding hands in their circle, swaying gently in rhythm with their collective voices. The scene was hauntingly beautiful rather than frightening, suggesting a spiritual ceremony rather than any kind of threatening activity. I stopped about 20 feet away from the circle, uncertain whether I should interrupt what appeared to be a religious or commemorative service. The figures seemed aware of my presence, but showed no signs of alarm or concern. Instead, several of them turned toward me and nodded in acknowledgement, as if welcoming me to observe their ceremony from a respectful distance. The ceremony continued for approximately 15 minutes, with the figures maintaining their circle and continuing their harmonious vocalizations. As their singing reached a crescendo, I began to notice that each figure was gradually becoming more translucent, fading slowly until they were barely visible against the cemetery's nighttime landscape. One by one, they disappeared entirely, until I was standing alone beside the lake, with only the sound of wind through the trees and distant traffic from the city beyond. I remained at that location for another hour, waiting to see if the figures would return or if I could find any physical evidence of their gathering. But the area around the lake showed no signs of recent human activity. The grass was undisturbed, there were no footprints in the soft earth, and nothing had been left behind to indicate that 20 people had been standing there just moments earlier. Over the following weeks, I continued to witness similar gatherings in different areas of Graceland Cemetery. Sometimes the figures appeared individually or in small groups, while other times they formed larger assemblies that seemed to be conducting elaborate ceremonies. I began to recognize certain recurring figures who appeared frequently at different locations, suggesting that these weren't random supernatural manifestations, but organized activities involving specific individuals who maintained ongoing connections to the cemetery. The most profound experience occurred during my final week, working at Graceland Cemetery in late November. During my 3 a.m. patrol round, I encountered an elderly woman in Victorian dress standing beside a particularly ornate monument in the cemetery's historical section. Unlike the other figures I had observed, she looked directly at me and began speaking in a clear, gentle voice. She explained that the people I had been seeing were former residents of Chicago who had been buried in Graceland Cemetery over the past 165 years. According to her, they maintained a spiritual connection to the cemetery and continued to visit their burial sites and participate in commemorative activities long after their physical deaths. She said that most living people couldn't perceive these continued activities, but that occasionally someone with the right sensitivity would be able to witness the ongoing spiritual life of the cemetery. She thanked me for treating their gatherings with respect rather than fear, and explained that my peaceful acceptance of their presence had allowed them to conduct their ceremonies without interference. She mentioned that cemetery security guards, who reacted with alarm or hostility to supernatural activity, often disrupted the spiritual peace that the deceased were seeking to maintain in their final resting place. Before disappearing like all the other figures I had encountered, she told me that my work at Graceland Cemetery was complete, and that it was time for me to move on to other security assignments where living people needed protection and assistance. She assured me that the cemetery's spiritual residents would continue to watch over the grounds and ensure that the peaceful atmosphere I had helped maintain would continue long after my departure. The next morning, I submitted my resignation to the cemetery administration, explaining that I had decided to retire from security work entirely. I didn't mention the supernatural encounters in my resignation letter, but I did note that Graceland Cemetery was one of the most peaceful and spiritually significant places I had ever worked, and that I felt confident it would remain safe and well protected for generations to come. I've been retired for 2 months now, but I sometimes drive past Graceland Cemetery in the evening and park near the main entrance. Through the iron gates, I can occasionally see the familiar figures continuing their nightly activities among the monuments and mausoleums. They appear to be maintaining the same ceremonies and gatherings I witnessed during my time as night security supervisor, suggesting that death doesn't end people's connection to places they loved in life. That's my story, and I'm sharing it because I believe that some locations serve as bridges between the world of the living and whatever exists beyond death. Graceland Cemetery taught me that burial grounds aren't just repositories for physical remains, but active spiritual communities where the deceased continue to find meaning and connection long after their earthly lives have ended. My 35 years in security work prepared me to protect living people from physical dangers, but Graceland Cemetery showed me that some places are already protected by guardians who understand both worlds and work to maintain peace between them. I hope these stories have given you insight into the mysterious world that exists just beyond our everyday perception, where the boundaries between life and death become blurred and the impossible becomes reality. Thank you for joining me on this journey through some of the most haunted and spiritually active cemeteries in America. Until next time, this is Silent Fears, reminding you that some mysteries are better experienced than explained, and that the dead may be far more active than we ever imagined.